Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video will be entitled The Wrecking Crew. Now, there may be numerous wrecking crews that you may think I'm referring to. I'm referring to the Los Angeles-based studio musicians who you've heard their music, which has appeared on any number of artists that you may follow. The Monkees, remember the Monkees had a television show? They were a put-together band in Hollywood that was a fake band. People who didn't really know each other, they answered a casting call and they became a rock and roll group known as the Monkees. But it was the Wrecking Crew who provided the studio music for them. But don't feel bad. I mean, they did the same thing with Sonny and Cher. They did the same exact thing with the Byrds. They did the same thing with Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley, which are pretty credible names in the music business, right? So they did the same thing with Jan and Dean. They did the same thing with the Mamas and the Papas, which included Cass Elliot, who was murdered in London, across the street from the Dorchester Hotel near Green Park in the Mayfair district of London. The Wrecking Crew provided the music of the Fifth Dimension. And Nancy Sinatra. Nancy Sinatra, these boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days, these boots are going to walk all over you, Nancy Sinatra. But don't feel bad. They provided the music for her father, Frank Sinatra. And remember this crazy poet named Bob Dylan? Well, they provided the music for Mr. Tambourine Man and Bob Dylan. They provided the music for Pet Sounds and the Beach Boys. The genius of Brian Wilson. Well, there wouldn't be a genius of Brian Wilson unless the Wrecking Crew could score the music. The Wrecking Crew. 20 to 40 musicians. Can't get an exact number because it wasn't really an official member of the Screen Actors Guild, right? Anyway, what I wanted you to know is there's all this emphasis on Laurel Canyon music, which is really the Wrecking Crew music. Laurel Canyon is the Wrecking Crew. There'd be no Laurel Canyon rock and roll music. There'd be no Neil Young without the Wrecking Crew. There'd be no social messaging coming out of the Laurel Canyon groups. Atlantic Records, Warner Brothers, Columbia Records, Janis Joplin. Okay, there'd be no Lou Adler and his Roxy Theater and Lou Adler and his recording label. There'd be no Lou Adler sitting next to Jack Nicholson at the Los Angeles Laker games, which he does, which I believe is a requirement. I believe Jack Nicholson and Leonardo DiCaprio, who was wearing a satanic black mask at the Warriors playoff game in Los Angeles the other night, and he's the only Hollywood CIA agent who was wearing a face diaper, because Jack Nicholson was not, and I believe Lou Adler was there and he wasn't. So I guess some people can wear face diapers and some people cannot, but they all work for the CIA, all of them. And the Wrecking Crew is completely controlled by the CIA, whether they mention it or not. They're in the social engineering creation business. And all these studios, United Western Recorders, Gold Star Studios, which was Charlie Manson's studio. You do know that Charlie Miles Maddox spent 8 hours recording with the Wrecking Crew on Santa Monica Boulevard for Gold Star Studios. That's where Sonny and Cher got their start. That's where Phil Spector did his Wall of Sound. And you do know the Wall of Sound was the Wrecking Crew. They were Wrecking Crew studio musicians who created the Wall of Sound attributed to Phil Spector. Then we have Capitol Records. Then we have Columbia Records, The Evil Eye. And of course, let's not leave out RCA and Victor Records, right? Because those are the big players. Everything eventually, you have to write a check to RCA and CBS. There's just no way to get your music played on the radio frequency, which we now know is now the smart grid 5G mesh. So you've got to pay to play. It's all about paying to play. But before the Los Angeles Wrecking Crew, from 1957 until whenever, the 1980s, the music industry was really Manhattan, New York. Okay? the home to Carole King. Remember Carole King? Not her real name. I always was a big fan of Carole King. I have been reluctant to dig into some of my favorite artists, Carole King being one of the biggest artists that I followed during my life, and of course that's not her name. Her name is Carol Joan Klein. She's Jewish. She was born in New York City on February 9th, 1942. I'm going to use Carole King, not her real name, as the metaphor for what we now know is nothing in Hollywood. There's the way things are, and then there's the way things are presented. And Carol Joan Klein is presented as a songwriter called Carole King. Turns out she's not. That's not really who she is. I mean, she kind of is, and she's kind of not. There's a whole team behind Carol Joan Klein that are Jewish. Almost everybody in this story is Jewish. Anyway, so she's born in 1942. That makes her 11 months. Well, she's 1 year older than Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was born a year later, in January 24th, 1943. So Carol Joan Klein was married a year before Sharon Tate was. They have similar tracks, believe it or not. Although Carole King is still alive. She's 81 years old. See, if today Sharon Tate would be 80 years old. So she was born Carol Joan Klein, and when she was 17 years old, it's kind of sketchy here. She supposedly attended Queens College, but she was pregnant at age 17 to her boyfriend, whose name is Jerry Goffin, 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 Jerry Goffin. Anyway, Carol gets pregnant at age 17 when Jerry is 20. He's 2.5 years older than her. And so she drops out of Queens College. She couldn't have been at Queens College long. That's where Jose Menendez went to college. Jose Menendez is 3 years younger than Carole King. So at this time, Jose Menendez is still in Havana, Cuba. He hasn't come over to New York yet. It hasn't happened yet. But Carole King is pregnant. And so she doesn't go to college. She's now has to raise a child. So she has her Jewish parents to help her. And her parents met in an elevator, believe it or not, in 1936 at Brooklands College. Her father was a chemistry major and her mother was in English and drama. So her parents were young in college when they met in an elevator. They were married, of course, in the Great Depression. Remember the Great Depression? It was a psychops, a banking psychops. There never was a Great Depression. You couldn't build the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam, Boulder Dam, and the Tennessee Valley Authority and fight the Japanese and Germans and get ready for war if you were in a banking depression. It's just not feasible. But on radio and newspapers, we had a Great Depression. Anyway, supposedly Carole King attended Queens College, but I don't believe she was there for more than a few days because she got pregnant. They did have a Jewish ceremony on Long Island in August 1959. Okay? Her first daughter, Carole King's first daughter, is Louise. Anyway, so they're now quit college and they're looking for work. And Neil Sedaka, another Jewish man who had dated Carole King before she got pregnant, he had a hit in 1959, which he named after Carole King, called Oh Carol. So Carol's new husband, Goffin, what's his name? Jerry Goffin, he takes the Neil Sedaka song. This is called song flipping, where you borrow or steal another person's idea. This goes on constantly. That is the songwriting business. The songwriting business is about borrowing, begging, stealing, or just obfuscating other people's intellectual property. There are no intellectual property rights in the music business unless you pay CBS and RCA, because there's no Paul McCartney song, no John Lennon song, no Bob Dylan song, no Carole King song is going to appear on the radio unless RCA or CBS or both of them get paid. Okay? So that's what the music business is, just like Wall Street. There are no original ideas. Carole King is not an original, songwriter, and neither was her first husband, Jerry Goffin. They're all borrowing and stealing. So Jerry gets this song, "Oh Carol," which he purloins from Neil Sedaka, and he turns it into "Oh Neil" to respond to Neil Sedaka's song about his new wife. So the first song that these two had was called "Oh Neil." Carole King recorded and released this as a single in 1959. The B-side of this single contained a Goffin King song, which was entitled "A Very Special Boy." That single record was not a success. All right? Anyway, this is important that you understand that the Brill Building in New York was the home of the conversion of rhythm and blues music into rock and roll or popular music. And rock and roll became pop music with a larger audience. And there's Carole King and her husband, Jerry Goffin, who's really forgotten in this whole story, because there'd be no Carole King, Carol Joan Klein, without Jerry Goffin, who's 3 years older than her. And he's the one that really introduced her to the Brill Building, where they became part of numerous songwriting teams. They had dozens of songwriting teams, and typically they're like Gladio teams of 3. You get a piano, you get a room, you're given an outline for a song that was probably created by an older man, and then they pump out songs like "Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow," which I had heard a song that Carol auditioned for the job at the Brill Building of Don Gershwin. I think that was his name, right? We're going to come back to her employer at Atlantic Records in a moment. Don Kirshner was her first boss. But the song that he went to lunch, and then Carol wrote the song "Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow" during the lunch break for Don Gershwin. That's a complete Mendasi. That's not what happened at all. That song was already outlined by some unnamed person who's probably 50 years old, and then it was given to Don Goffin, Jerry Goffin, who gave it to Carol, and then they, with a third person on the piano, came up with this song "Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow." And Jerry wrote the lyrics, and Carole King wrote the melody, supposedly. I don't know what to believe anymore, having looked into Hollywood. I basically don't believe that Carole King is a genius like I used to think she was. I think she's fun, she's a good entertainer, she's a good piano player. I don't think she wrote her music. I don't think Don McLean wrote American Pie. I don't think Robert Lamb wrote Dialogue. I don't think Paul McCartney wrote his music. I think the Tavistock Institute wrote Paul McCartney's music. I don't think John Lennon wrote his music. I know John Lennon didn't write Imagine. That was a communist who wrote Imagine. Anyway, I don't think anybody in the music industry is who they are presented as, okay? The Ed Sullivan Show, most of those acts were fake, okay? The Mamas and the Papas, they were presented, and they had this big orchestra accompaniment behind them, but that was all recorded because you notice they had no instruments. It was just John Phillips strumming a guitar, and well, who's playing the drums? Who's playing the organ? Where's the trombone section, right? So you see, the Mamas and Papas were like the Monkees. They were fake. They were fake. The Monkees are as legitimate as the Mamas and the Papas, who are as legitimate as the Beatles, who are basically a studio band playing other people's music. Hey, and that's what Phil Spector is, and that's what Sonny and Cher were. Every single artist presented on Capitol Records, Atlantic Records, Reprise, the Beach Boys, they're all put together by professional older adult supervision behind them. And then it's marketed to the demographic as required. That includes Frank Sinatra, who has a great voice, but he didn't play the music. He didn't write the music. Nancy Sinatra didn't write the song, These Boots Are Made for Walking. She didn't write that song. Elvis Presley never wrote a single song, and he was a terrific entertainer. Elvis Presley. He didn't write his music, and neither did Paul McCartney. Not in my opinion. There's no proof that he wrote his music. Michael Jackson, he didn't write his music either. Elton John, we know Elton John didn't write his music. The way they get around it is they say they co-wrote, like Brian Wilson co-wrote many of the songs for the Beach Boys. Well, that's code for a 55-year-old song team wrote the lyrics, and then the Wrecking Crew provided the melody. And then we gave credit to Brian Wilson, who may have had a small smidgen of contribution to the Beach Boys sound. Just like with Phil Spector. There'd be no Phil Spector wall of sound without the Wrecking Crew. Well, anyway, sometime around 1957, when Elvis Presley was gaining popularity, a decision in New York was made, hey, let's move this show out to Los Angeles, where we have all these film companies and television is becoming in vogue. Let's move the television shows and the film business and integrate it with the music industry out in Laurel Canyon, in Studio City, Burbank, Van Nuys, and Sunset Boulevard, and Gold Star Studios on Santa Monica Boulevard. Let's move it out there. So they did. That's what they did. So there was this migration of Jewish songwriters and Jewish session artists who played the drums, the bass, the rhythm guitar, the trombone, the trumpets, and these musicians who played in nightclubs and strip clubs back in New York and New Jersey, they migrated out to Los Angeles and combined with artists out in Los Angeles. And this is what constituted what later became referred to as the Wrecking Crew, or as what is often referred to as the Clique, or the First Call Gang, as the bass player that we all know and love, Carol Kay, said it was the Clique. Okay? The First Call Gang, the Wrecking Crew, whatever, they were paid individually. They were, according to Glenn Campbell, who eventually got his own TV show. This is really what Carole King was. Carole King was a member of a team, a large team, 20 to 30 people, songwriters or piano players to come up with melodies and lyrics. And so was Glenn Campbell, okay, who had no formal musical training. Glenn Campbell, and he's a brilliant guitar player, brilliant, but he was never professionally taught. Like many of the artists in the Wrecking Crew did have classical piano training and music instruction. They had backgrounds in both jazz and classical music. Not necessarily with Glenn Campbell, but he was a very famous person of the Wrecking Crew, later getting his own television show called the Glenn Campbell Good Times Hour, where, of course, they cross-marketed other Laurel Canyon groups and country groups onto the Glenn Campbell show, known as the, what was it called, the Glenn Campbell Happy Hour or Good Times Hour? All right, so the Wrecking Crew's contributions are generally concealed in the same way that the NATO bayonet attacks of Sharon Tate in Bennett Canyon have been concealed, because the Wrecking Crew's contributions on so many records, basically 99% of the records that you heard on the radio were created by the Wrecking Crew musicians. Some of the stalwart artists that you don't really know their names were, of course, Hal Blaine, who was the drummer. Then we have Don Randy, Al D. Leroy, Carol Kay, the bass player, Bill Pittman, Tommy Tedesco, who was a guitar player. All these people could play multiple instruments, by the way. Roy Vernon Caton played the trumpet. Jay Magliore, Steve Douglas, Ray Pullman. I apologize, I'm leaving out, 25 other names. But you see, the thing is, the whole point of the Wrecking Crew is they're clandestine, they're secret. You're not supposed to know. You're supposed to believe Nancy Sinatra wrote These Boots Are Made for Walking, or that Frank Sinatra scored and prepared the music that he sang, or that the Mamas and the Papas were a true icon band. The Monkees, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine, Nancy Sinatra, Sonny and Cher, Jan and Dean, The Fifth Dimension, the Byrds, the Monkees, they're virtually the same thing. They're just different front groups. Like Paul McCartney was the front man for the Beatles, okay? Neil Young became the front man for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But he's a polio survivor from Toronto, Canada, who was writing poetry with Charlie Manson at the swimming pool at 14400 Sunset Boulevard in the summer of 1968, when it was Charlie Miles Maddox who was given 8 hours at the Gold Star Studios, not Neil Young. Charlie Miles Maddox. So he actually had a higher status than, or an equal status to Neil Young in 1968. So next time you think of Charlie Manson, you should think that he was a geologist for the CIA in 1959. So you show that man the respect that he deserved, because he played with the Wrecking Crew in the wall of sound ceramic wall echo chamber known as Gold Star Studios. Anyway, they had many practices of music making during the 1960s, and they integrated New York City, Nashville, Memphis, Detroit, Muscle Shoals, tricks of the trade into Wrecking Crew produced music. Even though there really is no Wrecking Crew, right? We all understand it exists, but we don't talk about it. All right, anyway, I just wanted to wrap this up now. It's 22 minutes in. Nothing in Hollywood is as it seems. So they're all reading a script. It's all produced. It's a team of people. There is no one person who's successful from beginning to end, from birth to grave. It's impossible. It's a whole team, and there's adult supervision. There's social engineering messaging in all of the lyrics that you hear. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.